You know, for being one of the most historic and beloved martial arts battle series of all time, Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball has had a pretty strange time being adapted to video games over its decades-long tenure. It's had inconsistent forays into genres like RPGs and beat-em-ups, sure, but you'd think that fighting games would be the one genre where something like Dragon Ball would knock it out of the park. I mean, working with that license means you've got a whole slew of unique characters with distinct personalities, abilities, and fighting styles right out of the box. Half the work of designing a roster is basically done for you at that point. And yet, despite the property's many fighting game adaptations, few have ever gotten the recognition they wanted, let alone deserved. Dragon Ball fighting games from the 16-bit era are largely only remembered for oddities like the insane Piccolo tri-jump mix in Tosei's Super Butoden games. The Budokai games have their share of passionate players, but which only represent a very small community even by niche fighting game standards. And if the Budokai Tenkaichi games are remembered for anything, it's probably the way the BT3 modding scene expanded that game's cast well beyond the critical mass it managed to achieve on its own. And that's not even getting into more recent efforts like Xenoverse, Extreme Butoden, or even Dragon Ball FighterZ, which is only just now managing to catch a break from its various DLC debacles thanks to the imminent addition of real netplay. But there's one game among the many Dragon Ball fighting games across the history of the genre that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as any of these other games. A game which, outside of a small group of passionate players, went unsung for almost 20 years and is only just now getting the recognition it deserves. And with it, a need to figure out what that recognition will mean for the game going forward. That game is Super Dragon Ball Z, and I want to spend some time talking about it. Where it came from, where it is now, and where it might be going. Super Dragon Ball Z was initially released for arcades in 2005, with a home port hitting the PlayStation 2 1 year later in 2006. It was developed jointly by two studios, Crafts & Meister and Arica. Here's why this is important. These two companies were both founded by ex-Capcom staff. Crafts & Meister was founded by Noritaka Funamizu, while Arica was founded by Akira Nishitani. Both of these men were in leading development and production roles for Super DBZ, and also Street Fighter II: The World Warrior. In other words, Super DBZ's creation is due in no small part to the contributions of two guys who helped to basically invent fighting games as we know them. And boy does it show, because Super DBZ is hands down the most unique, inventive, forward-thinking fighting game I've ever played. Just about every Dragon Ball fighting game wants to try and replicate the feel of an actual fight from its source material. But something I find interesting is that each of the main Dragon Ball fighting game offerings from the PS2 era, Super DBZ as well as the Budokai and Tenkaichi games, all went about focusing on different aspects of this iconic style to achieve the goal of anime fight recreation. Dimps' Budokai games, thanks to their reliance on the tried and true Virtua Fighter formula to inform their mechanical design, places a really heavy emphasis on the fast, frenetic, close-range clashes seen in the show's more grounded battles. Spike Chunsoft's Tenkaichi games, by comparison, place less stock in these up-close interactions to focus more on the intense, high-octane aerial dogfighting seen in the flashier fights of the series. Super DBZ stands out by feeling much more measured than its contemporaries. A criticism from some game reviewers at the time was that the game lacked the almost hyperactive bombast that Dragon Ball games and the show proper were known for. And I think there are probably a few things we can attribute that more measured feeling to, but chief among them is that, well, it just kind of is more measured. Remember, the people responsible for this game helped make Street Fighter II. They'd had over 10 years of experience with the genre by this point, especially Arica, who had made 3 of their own Street Fighter games and the original fighting layer prior to Super DBZ. You ask fighting game developers to make a fighting game, well, they're gonna make a fighting game, you know? While that does leave the game feeling somewhat less energetic than its contemporaries on the surface, Super DBZ gives players a breadth of fun and creative ways to engage with its systems, so long as an effort is made to understand those systems. And when a few small groupings of players began to do just that, the appeal of the game, in turn, began to extend a lot further than just its license. I mentioned before that each of the main Dragon Ball fighting game offerings from the PS2 era all brought different elements of a fight from the source material to the fore. Budokai delivers the Mach Speed martial arts, while Tenkaichi lets players in on the supersonic skirmishes, but what does Super DBZ focus on? Well, saying the game sits somewhere between Budokai and Tenkaichi might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it's honestly not a bad place to start. While Super DBZ has a good mix of varied tools for both close-range offense and complex zoning, the game's true focus is principally on movement, which is expressed in both the immense diversity of its stage designs, which give players all sorts of obstacles, transitions, and changes in elevation to contend with, as well as in the wide variety of tools it provides players with to traverse those stages. I won't go too into depth on the game's mechanics, not just because we'd be here all day if I did, but also because friend of the channel ka-en-byou already made a fantastic video doing just that. I think it should suffice to say though that between the stage design, varied options for movement and combos, and flight mechanics so open-ended they'll have even the oldest of Marvel 2 oldheads thinking of the New York Knicks, the game has a pretty obvious baseline appeal for both fighting game players and Dragon Ball fans, and as a result has helped to build a small but very dedicated international following, with players ranging from the United States to East Asia and even Europe, with the most notable scene being in Japan, which still plays frequently in arcades even today. These base systems, which allow for cavernous strategic depth and creative skill expression, are given even further appeal by the game's extremely innovative skill tree system. This is by far the most notable element of Super DBZ's gameplay, expanding on players' ability to creatively express their desires and intentions in gameplay through the very construction of their character. Well before the custom variation system of Mortal Kombat 11, Super DBZ provided players the ability to adjust their character's moveset and base statistics by progressing through their skill tree. Once assigned to a character card, either on the memory card for the PS2 or to a physical data card for the arcade version, characters could earn experience by participating in fights and spend level ups on new skills, which, depending on the player's choice, would grant boosted statistics, expanded access to universal system mechanics, or frequently entirely new moves. This in turn was also bolstered by the skill inheritance system, which allowed a character with a completed skill tree to learn skills from another fully spec'd character. While this does mean that characters in Super DBZ don't become fully realized until their skill tree is completed, it also means that players are able to build up their characters in whatever way suits their preferences and playstyle. Very rarely does a character have a best set of skill assignments, and that leaves a lot of space for players to play exactly the kind of character that they want to play. The skill tree system helps to both color and expand the appeal of Super DBZ's already complex and powerful base systems, and I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that this combination of elements, when attached to the Dragon Ball license and developed by some of the most experienced visionaries in the genre's history, is a huge part of why, nearly 20 years on, the game still sees play from dedicated scenes all over the world. The burgeoning US scene is basically carried by the mighty efforts of GP Bear and the aforementioned ka-en-byou, the former of which is pretty much always running netplay sessions, teaching people the game, and often collaborating with the latter to bring the game to whatever major tournaments they can get out to. Matthias Wolfbrock of Wolf TV supports the game however he can over in France. Small groupings of players in places from Macau to Hong Kong play whenever they can, and, of course, the Japanese scene with titans of the game like Kabe, Kiru, and Nyaki frequently meet at the Big 1 Second Arcade in Saitama to play the game. Super DBZ may not have the biggest scene, but it certainly has a passionate one, and we have the game's openness to player customization and creativity to thank for that. But this factor, the game's greatest strength, may also be its greatest weakness in the long term. Now, that sudden change in gears might not make a whole lot of sense at first blush. I mean, the way I've been talking about this game so far has probably given the impression that it's got everything going for it. How is it that the gameplay systems, which could make the game so unique and beloved, could also be a weak point? Well, in fairness, if we're talking about the PS2 version, then it kind of isn't. The weaknesses there stem from the limited net play options and the fact that the PS2 is absolute hell to emulate without significantly more input lag than real hardware, but otherwise, console players are doing just fine. It's the arcade players we have to worry about. Super Dragon Ball Z was released for arcades in 2005. Specifically, it was released on the Namco System 256, an arcade board which also played host to a number of beloved arcade titles like the original Gundam vs. Gundam, the Kinnikuman Muscle Grand Prix games, and, of course, Tekken 5 and its major revision, Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection. One of the key features of the System 256 was a data card reader, which took internal chip or IC data cards that could be used to keep track of player data like completion statistics, win-loss records, and character customizations. In the case of Super Dragon Ball Z, these IC cards tracked a player's chosen color and, of course, their progress down their character's skill tree. Each card was designed only to work with its designated game, and often were region-specific on top of that. Despite all of these differences, however, there was one thing universal to all of the System 256's IC cards. They all tracked usage count. Whether it be due to technical limitations, just plain greed, or perhaps both, every System 256 IC card has a maximum number of uses. 500 to be exact, before the cabinet would refuse to read the data on the card, forcing the player to transfer the data over to another card. Which, of course, meant that every 500 games, players would need to buy another IC card to transfer their data over to. Back in 2005, or even up to 2010, this was an inconvenience to players, but not really much to be concerned about. In 2023 though, System 256 IC cards have been out of production for years now, and getting your hands on unused ones is only getting more and more difficult as supplies become increasingly rare, often needing to be bought from scalpers and people who charge a premium under the pretense of them being collectibles. And even under these circumstances, eventually, there will be no more cards. For a game like Tekken 5, this isn't much of a concern. With no IC cards, you won't be able to track your player rank and you'll lose your funny costumes, but you can pick Kazuya and he'll still play like Kazuya. The game will still be playable. For Super DBZ though, once the IC cards run dry, access to the skill tree as a whole will be lost, and the only characters available to play will be the base, technically incomplete versions of them. You can pick Cell, but he'll only play like half of Cell. The arcade version of Super DBZ at that point will basically cease to exist. The loss of the arcade version of the game would be significant, not just from a game preservation standpoint. The arcade version of the game has just enough differences from the console version to be meaningfully distinct, but also from a community activity standpoint. The main way the small Japanese community plays the game is at the Big 1 Second arcade in Saitama, which gives them a central meeting place for players to come together, hang out, and, of course, play the game they all love. It even serves as something of an international hub for the game, as the community will welcome any visitors from other countries to play the game with them at the arcade. Once the IC cards run out, and the arcade version becomes largely inaccessible as a result, this meeting place for the Super DBZ community will be all but lost, since there will be no game for them to play. I've spent this time talking to you about the past and present of Super DBZ because, unfortunately, its future isn't certain, and I'm kind of hoping that someone out there who watches this video will feel compelled to do something about it. I'd like to think that the game's developers and publishers would eventually re-release the game so it can continue existing in some form, but that's not looking likely, which means all we have to rely on is us. If you have any means to help out with System 256 emulation generally, or even something more specific like a hardware-level IC card emulator so that even when the cards are gone, everyone's player data will still be usable, then I implore you to do so. I'd offer to work on literally any of this myself, but I don't have the money to invest in arcade hardware, nor do I know the first thing about emulation development or how to reverse engineer this technology. I'm just a guy with a YouTube channel. So the best I can do, at least for now, is see if anyone out there can do that in my stead. So for those of you who are able and willing, please consider lending your support to these preservation and reverse engineering efforts, because Super DBZ deserves a future, and only we have the ability to give it one.